Hey everybody. So if you've been wondering why I've been doing all these videos lately, it's because I set a goal for myself and I was challenging myself to just kind of share some of my thoughts and experiences on different topics 2 times a week. Last week, I only did it once a week because I slacked off. And the only way you really actually get anything achieved is by setting a goal and then holding yourself accountable to it. So I'm going to be doing 3 of these this week, and I hope you don't get annoyed with me. But what I wanted to talk about today is what I've been studying over the last year for now lately, which has been the impending bloodbath coming in the California cannabis market. So what I mean by this is, and to really get you to understand the impact that I think is going to occur here, I need to set a little bit of history. But around this time last year, I was at New West in San Francisco, and Ricardo and I were doing a number of things at the same time. At one point, Ricardo was meeting with a lot of different growers in the Emerald Triangle and just learning about what was coming up with Amendment 64, which was going to switch California from a medical market to a recreational legal market. And was finding out some interesting information about their actual near industry-wide opposition to the recreationally regulated market. And that was kind of surprising. And so it was to New West. I meet him there. We meet with a few other growers and continue sort of exploring this topic. And then he went down to San Diego with our producer Vince Chandler at the Cannabis to explore this topic even further. And they made a really great documentary called As California Goes, which you should check out on the Cannabis. But what we found was that so many of California's legacy growers, or even new companies, really most of the people who were working within the industry producing cannabis were really opposed to the recreational legal market. Now, the reason why is extremely varied, but I've got a couple thoughts on it, and I'll sort of condense all their feedback as much as I possibly can so that you can kind of get a snapshot of what they were thinking. But before I do that, understand that California has had a medical market since 1996. It's been the longest market really ever existing on the cannabis space. So you're talking about, 20 plus years of a market that's existed in a medical regulated market. But the thing is that California's never had a regulated market. It's had a medically legal market, but it was never regulated through a system of standards the way that like the Colorado adult use recreational or medical market was run. And the reason why that's a distinction that needs to be understood is because when you're in an unregulated market, raids can happen. Certain standards aren't necessarily followed or ensured that they're met. Accountability isn't really there. In the California medical market, you are legally allowed to produce cannabis by registering with the state. They give you a particular number that you print out on this giant tarp, and you throw that tarp out near your canopy, which is where your outdoor grow is, so that when the helicopters fly over, they can see your number written down, look at the sheet, say, okay, we have this guy listed for 25 trees. There's the number, 25 trees, he's good to go. At that point, that's really where the trackability ends in the California medical market. What those growers do with their harvest is anyone's guess. I remember Ricardo told me a story of one of the people he was talking with. This guy's a grower, and he grows a lot of cannabis. The dude's producing, well over 100 pounds per harvest of outdoor cannabis, which is a lot, and at least for a small grow. And all of this was off the record because a lot of these guys are still dealing in a pretty illegal environment, and they didn't want to be on the record talking to him about what they were talking about. But one of the things that Ricardo asked him was, out of all of the cannabis that you grow, how much of it do you actually sell through a regulated, not regulated, but it's sort of like, a systematic medical system where you're taking your cannabis and you're selling it to a dispensary directly, and tracking that sale the same way that we have to dispense cannabis in Colorado. A grower grows it, it's all tagged and tracked through a system, then it's delivered and sold to dispensaries, all tracked and tagged back through the system again, so that every single seed to product is tracked through the system. That's not how California works at all. In fact, most of the California dispensary sales are happening in backpacks still, where guys are just showing up with, a couple ounces, couple pounds in their backpack, and they're selling it through these dispensaries. And I was a little bit shocked coming into the market, kind of new, learning that that's how California operated. I always assumed that this was all being tracked through the whole system or whatever, and the DEA was just sort of being assholes when they were raiding. I mean, they're always being assholes when they're raiding. But when we talked with when Ricardo talked with this grower, he asked him, how much of all of your cannabis that you harvest do you sell legally through that system? And he looked back at one of his guys and was like, what is it, like an eighth? Like an eighth of an ounce of all of this cannabis we sell legally. The rest of it is all sold in the black market. It's anyone's guess where it goes. It's sold to guys in backpacks. In Texas, most of the cannabis that you're getting in Austin or whatever that's not actually grown in Texas is coming from California, not actually coming from Colorado as much. It's a lot easier for that to happen there. And because none of that cannabis is really tracked outside of the growers, there's no one there to regulate where it goes. So a lot of it can exist in the black market. This is one of the reasons why it's problematic for any state at this point to not be allowing or decriminalizing, cannabis growing within the city or within their states, because the fact that a place like Texas exists where you can't consume, but you have a large demand, is what causes, places that have these black market loopholes like California's had for so long to be able to just take all their cannabis and ship it into Austin. So anyway, that's sort of the background of the medical market. For 20-something years, this is how this has been going. Now, when we were talking with the growers about their opposition to 64, they have a lot of good answers, and some of them are very legitimate. Like, they're afraid of unlimited canopy in the growth, which means that they're, big ag Monsantos or, the big wine makers could come in and just throw down, hundreds and thousands of acres of cannabis land and just start outgrowing everybody and selling and driving the market down. And that's a legitimate concern, although arguably most cannabis consumers aren't looking for, less than $99 ounce cannabis. That's usually a younger market or a lower income market, which certainly there's a major demand for and should be accessible to. But at the same time, most of these cannabis growers grow boutique stuff that's organic or, supposedly organic and really high end. So, that complaint seemed a little bit off place. Other complaints were just in the sense that people don't want to have their data tracked. They shouldn't necessarily have to work within a regulated market to just get access to a plant. Also, a very legitimate concern. But when you consider that for so many of these companies, and I can't throw you a statistic that's really credible, but it seems like from the conversations we were having, like 99% of the companies that operate in a black market, you start to wonder, well, maybe they don't want a regulated market because everything they do is allowed. They're not being held to pesticide standards, to testing standards. They are not being forced to grow in any particular fashion, or they're not necessarily being restricted from growing in a particular style or using specific chemicals or pesticides. They don't have to do checks on the ground and the soil that they are growing within, which could be contaminated with heavy metals, or it could be contaminated with other toxins, all of which cannabis is very effective at sucking up out of the soil. So there's a lot of things that are going to come with the regulated market that California is not prepared for. Another thing is packaging requirements. I mean, I can get a chocolate bar on the cannabis market in LA or San Francisco, and it doesn't have to be child-proofed, and it doesn't have to have certain testing results listed on the packaging. But if you buy a chocolate bar with cannabis in it in Colorado, good luck getting into that easily. It's packaged in a specific way that kids can't get into it, and that's because that's what a regulated market brings, as well as testing requirements for pesticides and things to that effect. Out of all the markets in the United States that have regulated cannabis, the ones that have the hardest regulations have been Colorado and Oregon, I believe. Oregon specifically got a lot of flack because their regulations were almost so steep that the market couldn't survive them, and so they sort of pulled some of those back. The California regulations that are going to go into place in January are actually stricter than the Oregon regulations that they had to pull back from. And someone might want to check that back for me. I'm pretty sure that's what their regulations are going to look like. So they're going to have to do tons of testing. They're going to have to meet tons of packaging requirements. requirements, none of which very many of these companies have ever even had to think about because they've had 20 plus years of not having to worry about these things. They don't have to worry about food safety standards, for instance. But once you're talking about edibles and trying to get federal regulation, obviously being able to have food safety standards met is a minimum requirement. And a lot of these people are making food grade products with absolutely no safety standards on a traditional food environment being met. The best companies out there have been testing, have used food safety standards, are operating the way that the very advanced federal market will eventually require, and they're doing it right from the start. And that is something that is really important. Look for those brands because they've been doing it right because they know it's important to do it right. But most of everybody else is not doing it that way. In fact, if they could get away with it, why spend all the money on the onerous packaging when it's not required? So here they are in a place now where they're about to have these regulations impending in January, and all of them are going to have to change their business models for the most part to meet those regulations, with the few exceptions that I just listed. And to give you a sense of how enormous of a problem this is, when I was recently in Oakland just a couple weeks ago, I was meeting with one of the biggest testing laboratories in the entire United States. And their name's Steep Hill Laboratories, and at their headquarters in Oakland and Berkeley, they've done a number of different tests on just cannabis sourced from all over the state to determine how many of them would meet minimum pesticide requirements, let alone the actual impending pesticide requirements that are going to be coming out of the regulated market in January. And I've seen numbers as low as 85% failure to as high as what Steep Hill reported, which was 93% failure. Which means that of all the cannabis they tested, 85 to 93% of all of it in California, due to sample size, and of course this isn't going to be exact, will fail pesticide standards. Some of those minimum pesticide standards that just any general market would not allow. I think that was as high as something like 35% of all the cannabis in California wouldn't pass any pesticide standard in the nation, let alone the cannabis pesticide standards, of which almost 85 to 93% are going to fail. So think about that. 22 something years of an industry existing in a state that is now about to make a major hard left shift into regulated pesticide requirements and labeling requirements and all other sorts of requirements and tracking that none of these people have ever had to apply to themselves to. They've never had to meet these standards. And knowing that there's going to be this amount of fail test impending means that there's going to be a major bloodbath ensuing in California when it comes to existing cannabis companies and how they can survive it. You got to think about the cost just in general to adapt your company from where it was, where you were probably using minimal expense on just about everything because you could get away with it, to now having to implement all these different standards and meet all these different requirements, acquire all this software, buy new packaging. Tom, as you're commenting here, it does seem cheaper at this point to just move to a different state and open up your cannabis company there, but it's fraught with all sorts of other issues like trying to get a license. So it's not so easy as it sounds, but the expense of being able to adapt to these new environments is going to be extreme. Most of them won't survive. Who's going to come in and make it work? Well, you're going to get a lot of existing legacy business people who are outside of the cannabis industry who know how to adapt to standards and build agricultural pharmaceutical companies. It seems that perhaps the woes and concerns of the cannabis growers we were talking to last year about big ag and big farm coming in and taking over major farmland wasn't necessarily as valid when you were thinking about it just in terms of them having competition, but it kind of seems valid when you look at the sense that they're probably not going to survive these regulatory changes, and who will? People who have that experience. I mean, it's not all going to be big ag, it's not going to be big farm. There's a lot of great companies that will survive, and there's a lot of great companies that have been doing it right, and they do grow organic, clean, very high quality cannabis. In fact, arguably, California's outdoor grows produce some of the tastiest and best quality cannabis in the nation. I can't wait for the grow off and Jake Brown to prove that wrong, but we'll see. But that's what's coming in California, and it is going to be a bloodbath. It's not going to be pretty. And there's pros and cons to this regulatory environment. The pro is that under these new environments, they'll actually be able to push federally the entire country towards a sustainable industry that can happen on a federal regulatory environment. because California is so big, the world's 6th largest economy, right? Biggest economy in the United States. So you're going to see a major impact regardless, just because if they can get it done and they can do it right, then the federal government will have a lot less concern about whether they should or should not start moving on this federally. So Cali will be, you know, the benchmark and sort of the momentum the entire country has needed to push this all the way. But there's some also positive negatives here, or possible negatives here, which is that if it is indeed that as much as 90% of the cannabis companies are going to fail the new regulatory environment, what's going to be exposed is what they've been doing for 20-something years. If we find out that over 50% of the legal medical cannabis sold in California has heavy metals, for instance, in it, which is very possible at this point, what is that going to say for growing practices across the United States? What is that going to say for the safety of cannabis? You're going to find all of the anti-cannabis, you know, hocus pocus people out there who think the boogeyman is cannabis are going to come out and say, look, it's everything we've said all along. Look at all the heavy metals. There's no telling what's in this cannabis. It's going to poison you. And you know, that's somewhat of a legitimate concern if it's going to be as high as we think it might be. You know, the pesticides and the fertilizers, and I'm not even talking about human rights violations. So again, because of the gray market of California, we have learned some atrocious human labor violations that have occurred, human rights violations and labor violations that have occurred on cannabis grows. Things from, you know, something as benign as just people being overworked and not getting, you know, any sort of labor protections in any way, to something as hideous as sexual abuse and trafficking. And that's not just with the cartel grows. I mean, you hear about the cartel grows all the time. These are also just some of the general California cannabis grows are just that dangerous. I've heard people talking about working for companies where it felt like they were literally working in a war zone. Everyone around them was armed with AR-15s, and they felt like they could be attacked at any time. So in those environments, under that fear, a company is not going to operate normally. A company is not going to operate necessarily ethically either. And this isn't the norm, but this is definitely one of the things that exists. So, you know, sort of the skeletons in this closet are all going to come out. For 20-something years, we haven't really talked about them. But when you force the flashlight on the problem through regulation, you're going to start learning some really awful things, I think. And it's not going to look good for the cannabis movement in the United States if some of this starts coming out as bad as it could look. So, you know, as much as we're all excited in the industry about California coming into a recreationally legal market, and we're all excited about the momentum that might possibly provide to the federal legalization conversation, we should be extremely wary of the fact that this also could be a very bad thing. And it could set the market back a couple years, because we're about to learn some really disgusting stuff, I think, or at least some dirty stuff. And the dirty stuff's not going to do us a whole lot of good. Certainly not going to cut us any favors. And, you know, there's other things that are attacking the market that we should think about and just talk about for a second, which is like the fires in Northern California. There are a lot of legitimately good growers and families out there that are losing everything. They're losing their farms. They're losing, you know, their entire businesses and their livelihoods. Some of them may survive it, but many won't. So there are a number of different opportunities to help provide fire relief, especially in the cannabis community, and I know a number of those are going to be popping up left and right. Look in California, I know in the Bay Area there were a number of events recently to raise funds for the cannabis community, and if I can find those links, I'll try to put them in the comments so that you can access those. But in the meantime, I think a cursory Google search should help you find ways that you can help other cannabis farmers who are losing everything, and these are some of these farmers are the ones doing it right. So anyway, that's my thoughts on California. I am excited to see where it goes. There's obviously a huge amount of economic potential and federal regulatory potential that could come from this. And so, you know, by no means am I trying to be, you know, the canary in the coal mine that California is going to be an impending doom. I think people who speak in absolutes are idiots in that way, because we don't know what's going to happen. This could be good. It could be bad. We could find out that, you know, Steve Hill only tested a certain amount of samples that just happened to be prone to failure, and that the entire market's not really going to experience 90-something% fail rates on their regulatory tests. But regardless, if you want to have a future career in the cannabis industry that is probably very well protected, enter testing or enter labeling or packaging segments of the industry, especially compliance, because what they're going to have to deal with is about to be extreme, and they've never had to deal with it before, so they need your help. Anyway, those are my thoughts in California. I will see you tomorrow when I come back to talk about something else. Thank you.